You've likely heard the phrase, it's the thought that counts. But is it the thought that counts? Somebody tries to do something nice, arrange for a surprise birthday party, or buys a gift, does something one thinks will be seen as doing a favor. And then things go wrong. But we don't blame the person. In fact, we give them moral credit for trying, assuming they really did try. Their heart was in the right place. They meant well. In the late 1800s, a philosopher named James Martineau, well known at the time but since forgotten, argued for a theory of morality that said that actions obtain their value from the quality of their motives. If you want to know whether an action is right or wrong, you need to find out what motivated that person. Was it wrong to lie? Well, did the person lie in order to manipulate others for purely selfish ends? Or did they lie, for example, to hide an escaped Jew from the Nazis, or in planning a surprise birthday party? Was a killing done to defend an innocent person from a malicious attack, or was it done to eliminate a rival? Or was it an accident, something that happened without any motive behind it at all? Around 1900, another philosopher, Henry Sidgwick, raised serious objections to that way of thinking. Now, before I present his argument, let me say some words about the type of argument Sidgwick is using. What I'm talking about here is a disproof by counterexample. Let's assume that somebody made the claim that all swans are white. How would you refute them? Well, you could refute them by showing them a black swan. You only need one. If there is one black swan, then you have proved that it's not the case that all swans are white. According to Martineau's theory, all actions get their moral value from the value of their motives, meaning that one way to refute Martineau is to provide examples where the rightness or wrongness of an action doesn't match the quality of the motive. And this is what Sidgwick did. His example of a wrong act from a good motive involves an adult child who lies under oath to prevent a parent from being convicted of a crime. Affection towards one's parents is generally considered a virtue, a good quality to have, so long as the parent treated the child well. We're assuming here that the parent has treated the child well and that the crime in no way victimized the child. He embezzled from the office, for example, or he and some friends smashed a window in a store and made off with some merchandise. The adult child, who has evidence relevant to the case, has an obligation to tell the truth that parental affection cannot override. Once we find an example, it becomes easier to see others. Burning down a business because it's competing against the business that one's close friend owns and operates. Killing an individual so that their organs can be donated to others who need organs. Nearly anything that counts as harming an individual so as to produce a benefit, not for oneself, but for others, is an example of a wrong act with a good motive. Sidgwick also provides an example of a right act done from a bad motive. Here, we can imagine a prosecutor who believes, wrongly as it turns out, that the defendant in a case said or did something that harmed the prosecutor when both were children. And since then, the prosecutor has held a grudge. We should further assume that this prosecutor is generally quite sloppy and has sometimes failed to convict and has had convictions overturned as a result of sloppy mistakes. However, when presented with this case, a desire for revenge for a wrong that didn't even exist motivates the prosecutor to take special care. The prosecutor wants to make sure that this prosecution is free of mistakes that the defendant could then use to escape punishment. The prosecutor's actions are all right actions, even though the prosecutor is acting on a bad motive. Another set of examples that go against the thesis that it's the motive that gives an action its value, a particularly large set, involves negligence and recklessness. What's the motive for drunk driving? The drunk driver only wants to get home. It's a perfectly legitimate motive shared by many of the other drivers on the road at the same time. It's not a motive that makes an action wrong. The motives for negligent actions or even reckless actions are typically ordinary motives that govern individual lives. What makes these actions wrong has to do with a motive that's missing a proper regard for the interests of others. If negligent and reckless acts get their value from the motives behind them, then few negligent or reckless acts would actually be wrong. These examples provide us with a whole flock of black swans, whole sets of actions that don't get their moral value from the value of the motives that give rise to them. And this provides us with a lot of reasons to reject Martineau's thesis that it's the motive that counts. But in 1999, Rosalind Hursthouse published a book called On Virtue Ethics, in which she presented a different way of relating actions to motives. She wrote, quote, "An action is right if and only if it is what a virtuous agent would characteristically, i.e. acting in character, do in the circumstances." Unquote. One way of understanding this view is to consider the Christian slogan, "What would Jesus do?" Under the assumption that Jesus is a moral exemplar. One way to determine what one should do in a given circumstance is to ask what Jesus would do in that circumstance. The perjury case, which was an example of a person acting on a good motive of protecting their parent, but doing so with a wrong act of perjury, works against Martineau's theory. However, when applied to Hursthouse's characterization, we get a different result. Yes, the virtuous agent would want to protect their parent, but not to the point of lying under oath. A motive of being truthful under oath would outweigh, perhaps painfully outweigh, but outweigh nonetheless, the desire to protect one's parents. And consider the case of the wrongful prosecutor. Remember, this was the prosecutor who falsely believed that the accused wronged the prosecutor when both were children. And now the prosecutor seeks revenge and is trying to get it by making sure that the case is free of mistakes that the accused could use to escape punishment. On Hursthouse's formulation, the prosecutor is still doing the same things that a virtuous prosecutor would have done. So none of the prosecutor's acts are wrong, even though the prosecutor is acting from a bad motive. On the issue of negligence, a virtuous person has a certain amount of interest in the well-being of others, so the virtuous person thinks ahead and makes sure that their actions will not cause harm. A virtuous person will not drive while drunk, though on Hursthouse's account, drunk driving counts as a wrong act. Hursthouse's view does have one interesting and perhaps unexpected implication. Performing an action because it's the right thing to do isn't a virtue. David Hume, though he wrote 250 years before Hursthouse, recognized this implication. For an action to be right, a virtuous person would have to do it for some other reason and not because it's the right thing to do. Why is this the case? To show that this is the case, we start with Hursthouse's principle that an act is right if and only if it is what a virtuous person would do. We add to this the thesis that a virtuous person would perform the act because it is the right thing to do. And then we ask, why is it the right thing to do? The answer, because it's what a virtuous person would do in those circumstances. And why would a virtuous person do that in those circumstances? Well, because it's the right thing to do. The proposition we're looking at says that the virtuous person would perform the action because it's right. And then we ask, why is it right? On Hursthouse's principle, it's right because it's what the virtuous person would do in those circumstances. And why would the virtuous person do it? The virtuous person would do it because it's right. And at this point, we can see that there's a very serious problem. The two propositions, if taken together, are viciously circular. One of the two claims has to go. This is what Hume wrote on the matter. To suppose that the mere regard to the virtue of the action may be the first motive which produced the action and rendered it virtuous is to reason in a circle. Before we can have such a regard, the action must be really virtuous, and this virtue must be derived from some virtuous motive. And consequently, the virtuous motive must be different from the regard to the virtue of the action. A virtuous motive is requisite to render an action virtuous. An action must be virtuous before it can have a regard to its virtue. Some virtuous motive, therefore, must be antecedent to that regard. End quote. So to give this some practical meaning, a friend doesn't help their friend because it's the right thing to do. A friend helps their friend because, well, it's their friend and their friend needs some help. A truly charitable donation isn't made out of a sense of duty. It's done out of a desire to relieve suffering or to promote some social good. The virtuous person keeps a promise not because it's one's duty, but because one promised, because, as they see it, people are counting on me. All of this leads to the question, what is a virtue? As discussed in the previous video, Hume takes a virtue as a character trait that is useful to others, pleasing to others, useful to the agent that has it, and pleasing to the agent that has it. Useful and pleasing, not because it causes the agent to perform right actions, but because it either directly or indirectly promotes the interests and appeals to the sentiments of oneself and others. Aristotle, in contrast, held that the virtues were those character traits that allowed one to have a good life or to live well. In contrast to the Humean model, being useful or pleasing to others has no direct relevance. Though a person without good friends, a concern for the community, and public approval can't be expected to have a good life. Hursthouse develops a more modern version of the Aristotelian account. Variations on the Aristotelian theme make up the lion's share of virtue theories, in fact. So there's more work to do. To know the difference between right and wrong, we still need to know what the virtues are. But is that a problem? Well, we'll discuss that question in the next video. In this video, my aim has been to show that the idea that it's the thought that counts, that idea has some serious problems. Even if one's heart is not in the right place, one can still act as somebody whose heart is in the right place, would have acted, and in that way, do nothing wrong. Perhaps one would not be praised for their virtue, but they would not be blamed for wrong actions either.